Video gaming industry is a major modern history phenomenon, with an estimated $150 million spent by consumers on video games each year. This is an industry that has only been around for roughly 50 years, but is likely still in its infancy in terms of its ultimate size many years into the future. In this video, we will take a closer look at one of the most successful players in video gaming industry today, a California-based company called Electronic Arts. EA's claim to fame comes from a small number of high-performing gaming titles, which have been accounting for the lion's share of its roughly $4 to $5 billion revenue pool for years. These titles are familiar to many, including sports simulators such as FIFA, Madden NFL, NHL, NBA, and UFC, and popular games in other genres such as Battlefield, The Sims, Apex Legends, Need for Speed, and Star Wars. Chances are that by now, even if you yourself are not a player, you know someone who is a fan of one or more of EA's blockbuster titles. The story of EA started in the early 1980s, when one of Apple's early employees, Trip Hawkins, left the famous computer manufacturer in order to start his own software publishing company. The name Electronic Arts was chosen by the early employees of the company in recognition of the idea that writing good software was less of a trade and more akin to an art form. And while early on in its history, EA experimented with various forms of software, including a drawing application called Deluxe Paint, over time, it has found its primary strength to lie in gaming. Interestingly, EA's early business model was to outsource video game development to third-party contractors in order to have more flexibility and avoid hiring large numbers of staff for unproven early titles. However, the company quickly discovered numerous issues with this model, including a reduced ability to control quality and timeliness in the development of its video games. It therefore switched to its current model, bringing more of its game development in-house and occasionally buying out other game development companies in order to both grow its product portfolio and acquire additional industry-tested talent. So how does EA manage to make $4 to $5 billion in sales of video games every year, which, as an example, is equivalent to the GDP of some small countries such as Fiji, Barbados, or Montenegro? Well, EA reports its revenue in four major categories: full game downloads, live services, mobile and packaged goods, and other. Live services represents the biggest revenue category for EA, accounting for $2.8 billion, or 50% of the company's total sales figure in fiscal year 2020. Live services is a lucrative business line, and it primarily represents additional content that EA makes available within their base games, which players can choose to purchase in order to enhance and extend their gaming experience. This additional content includes extra player packs in EA's blockbuster soccer simulator FIFA, or extra maps and machinery in its first-person shooter game Battlefield. In most instances, people can still enjoy EA's games without this additional content. But given competitive dynamics within many of its games, many players choose to open their wallets. Which raises a controversial point in the industry around a gaming phenomenon called pay-to-win. In pay-to-win situations, players who are willing to pay real money for additional virtual items often gain advantage over their non-paying competitors, which in turn stimulates more demand for these items among other players, resulting in a flywheel-like dynamic. Nowadays, this dynamic has slowly become the holy grail of video game development, able to turn offerings around additional paid content into essentially money-printing machines, given enough scale and competitive intensity of certain gaming titles. Taking EA's reported numbers as guidance, we see that its live services business line accounts for 50% of the company's overall revenues, which means it makes as much money as the rest of the base business combined. Think about it this way. While selling base games is what often pays for most of the software development costs, selling additional content within base games often comes at minimal incremental cost, as most of the code infrastructure at that point has already been developed. This often makes business lines built around additional paid content within existing base games the primary source of video game publishers' overall profitability. Rest of EA's overall revenue is derived from sales of base video games hosted across all modern gaming platforms, including console, PC, and mobile. Base games revenues typically fluctuate year to year, depending on how well the company's new releases are doing in the market compared to previous year's results, as well as those released by their competitors. In EA's case, because their revenue structure is dominated by only a small number of blockbuster titles, such as FIFA, which get updated and released anew in the third quarter of every year? Base game revenues have been largely shielded from the yearly fluctuations at the whim of the marketplace. So that covers revenue. But what about profitability? It turns out that EA is equally as successful at maintaining a steady flow of customer money coming in every year as they are at putting that money to profitable use. For the last several years, EA's direct cost of producing and maintaining its portfolio of video game titles has only accounted for around 30% of its total annual sales, which is quite an impressive figure. What this means is that if you take an average EA video game, let's say a new edition of FIFA, which costs around $60 to buy, it would only cost EA around $20 to develop that title and maintain a stable gaming environment, including on the internet. This is quite a good profitability level, and it allows EA to have a lot of financial flexibility when it comes to running its business and paying back the shareholders. You might be wondering, with direct costs at only 30% of overall sales, what does EA do with the rest of the money? Another 10 to 15% is spent on communication and marketing surrounding new game launches, while another 10% goes to cover EA's general corporate expenses. These are quite reasonable numbers, and together with its direct cost of sales, they amount to roughly 45 to 50% of total revenue, which is the total amount of money it takes EA to run its base business. Rest of the proceeds, after covering required taxes and paying down its debt, the company could theoretically spend rewarding its shareholders in the form of dividends. However, that is not what EA does. A whopping 30% of its overall sales goes into a category of expenses called research and development. This amounts to about $1.5 billion every year, an amount of money equal to roughly half the GDP an entire country the size of Andorra is able to produce in a year. This money is spent on making sure the company is able to experiment and innovate, and ultimately bring new blockbuster titles to the market in the future. High amounts of research and development spending is quite an interesting phenomenon, particularly when it comes to the software industry. As an example, Google and Facebook are both heavy spenders on R&D, with their recent budgets on the order of $20 billion a year, or roughly 15 to 20% of their annual sales. Given that a lot of these companies are at the cutting edge of their respective fields, investing heavily in innovation is not only part of their cultural DNA, but is also a necessity if they want to guarantee the longevity of their business for decades to come. So that leaves us with a very high-performing software development, distribution, and management business, which has figured out an ingenious way to guarantee a steady and mostly predictable amount of revenue coming in every year by releasing highly anticipated updates to its blockbuster sports simulator video games on an annual basis. On top of that, EA has figured out an even more ingenious way to essentially double the size of its business by getting people to pay more money for additional virtual items and further enhancements to the player's gaming experience after they have already purchased the base games themselves. All of this allows EA to generate a significant amount of surplus revenue, which the company chooses to mostly invest in further research and development to further enhance its competitive position and revenue earning power many years into the future, which is a great sign for gaming fans around the world, as it means that there will be more captivating video games and related content coming their way from EA and its competitors in their quest to stay at the top of this relatively new but rapidly growing modern history phenomenon called the video gaming industry.